This talk is in memory of Ayang Rinpoche, who I met through the good fortune of a friend, Margot, on the island of Maui, who called me one day and said a great master that she has received teachings from was visiting Hawaii, and if I would act as a guide during his 7-day visit. I accepted, and received teachings. He was coming for a 7-day Amitabha empowerment at the Maui Dharma Center. And those teachings I received. But equally remarkable was just being with the Master for 7 days, almost continuously. He stayed in a small house on the beach near mine, and my daughter Rachel and I were there every day in the morning and eating with him and getting prepared for the day. And I took him on tours of the island. When he first arrived, his baggage wasn't there when he arrived. This is generally not a cause for great alarm. It happens and the baggage usually comes, but in this case it was all 2 pieces of luggage that were such that they contained all of his ritual objects and the teachings, that text that he was going to teach from. And of course, most of these ritual objects are very old, and he was, of course, in such a spot that without these necessities, it would have been not only impossible to teach, but a great loss to not having these objects. However, the Master was unfazed. I made the necessary arrangement that when they found him, they'd be delivered to my house rather than his. He didn't say a word about that, but he raised his eyebrows and looked at me a little bit scornfully, like, why is not going to where I'm staying? The fact of the matter is I felt it would have been safer going to mine rather than his, in as much as I could control the luggage if in fact it didn't arrive as expected. Not a word was mentioned about that. The Master was so patient, he never asked did they call about the luggage or anything like that, although he was teaching the day after he arrived. In between, the next day began one of the most remarkable days of my life, and all of those in the car. And I found out later that it was one of the most remarkable days for Rinpoche himself. The day began, as usual, for such days out on Maui, especially to the Haleakala crater, which is a couple of hours drive up a very steep mountainside. But it seemed like everything around Rinpoche was happening very auspiciously every time we did anything for the whole week. It just so happened while we were driving up towards the crater, Margot got a call from her close friend that lived about halfway up the side of the crater in a place called Makawa, a small city. I should say it's sort of like a village on the way up to the crater, and it's the last major outpost before you get there. And there's houses strung along the way for another few miles, and then it's all barren mountainside, I should say volcano side. Lava, all lava. So the call that Margot received was quite alarming. A good friend of hers said her husband was in the last stages and was going to die any time, perhaps in the next hour or a few minutes. And I don't know how she happened to know, or if she happened to know, that we had in the car a great Phowa master. Ayang Rinpoche was told by the 16th Karmapa that he should do nothing but teach Phowa throughout his life. And that's what he did, nonstop. He dedicated his life to following that instruction from the 16th Karmapa. Phowa is a transference of consciousness of someone after or before, in some cases, death. Oftentimes a person has died and someone will call a Phowa master to make sure the consciousness goes through the in-between states of immediately following death to a favorable rebirth in a heavenly realm or a favorable rebirth on earth. And conversely, if the person hasn't died and is just about to die, they will facilitate the departure and send them out of their body and off to a new rebirth, a favorable rebirth. Without going more into details on that, I would suggest anybody that's curious is to just look up Phowa in a spiritual text, Phowa. Again, that's Phowa, and you can learn quite a bit about it. But this talk isn't on Phowa, it's about Ayang Rinpoche and being with him and what it was like being with him. So when Margot received this call, we happened to be about 5 minutes from Makawa. And Rinpoche said, well, let's stop at that house in Makawa, and I will go in there and help this person that's a friend of Margot out of his body. My daughter and I, of course, we were a group of 5 or 6. Nobody but Rinpoche and perhaps Margot was to go into that house. So my daughter Rachel and I, we said, okay, let's go. There happened to be a flea market. We'll go to the flea market, and we told Margot to call us when we should be ready to go up to the crater, Haleakala crater. Rachel and I spent an hour in the flea market, and then we got a call from Margot that Rinpoche had sent this person out of his body and on to a new rebirth, and we should pick him up. So we picked up Ayang Rinpoche and Margot, and then we continued up on our journey. The day in the crater was just amazing. Of course, every day in the crater is amazing. And aside from saying that we had an incredible time, which we did, I cannot say more about it. One would have to go there but we had sort of a typical day in the Haleakala crater. as typical as it could be with such a wonderful group of people, particularly being around Rinpoche the whole time. Of course, he's a mountain person, and going up and down into the crater was nothing for him. Tiring for some of us. It's about, I think, 10,000 feet or so. And we spent the day in there. And then on the way, and then we had a little picnic at towards sunset. We were above the clouds, an incredible array of clouds. Rinpoche said to me, "Why don't you park your car?" I had a 470 Lexus, which is a SUV Lexus. He said, "Why don't you park your car on the edge of that cliff there, so it looks like it's floating in the clouds?" Well, I didn't think anything of it. I didn't even think of why I would need a photo of my car floating in the clouds. But I just thought, just for the fun, I should do it. So I parked the car there, floating in the clouds. Then about 5 years later, I asked somebody to sell my car. I was elsewhere. I think I was in Nepal. Actually, I was in Dharamsala, India. So I asked him to sell my car. And she tried to sell it, and she couldn't sell it for what I wanted, which was at least what the amount I wanted. She'd always get like half the amount I wanted. So a few months later, it happened I was back on Maui. And I was thinking I should sell that car. So all of a sudden, a photo I had long forgotten about came to mind, that photo of that car in the clouds. So I posted that photo on Craigslist on Maui. 10 minutes later, I got a call. He said he wanted the car and he'd pay cash. He arrived with the cash and the car was sold. So that's just a side note of some of the auspicious things around Rinpoche. But that's not so significant, so I'll tell some more. Between teachings, I took Rinpoche to the Iao Needle, which is an incredible spot on Maui with waterfalls, and it's a very, very beautiful place. Gardens, waterfalls, native plants that are planted by actually high school children and younger children of native species throughout the area, which is several square miles of lush pools of crystal clear waters and waterfalls. It's sort of a Garden of Eden on Maui. And it happened that part of that day was we had a picnic at the spot. And Margot and Ayang Rinpoche and Becky, as a tenant, were on one side of the table, and Rachel and I were on the other side of the table. And at one point, you know, everybody's talking to everybody else, and it just so happened that Margot and Rinpoche and Becky were talking about something, and Rachel and I just started talking about various things, and then Rachel and I started talking about my friend Sean. And Sean called me about 2 weeks earlier, and the first words he said when I picked up the phone is, "I'm done." I said, "What do you mean you're done?" He says, "Well, I've got cancer. My stomach is out of my body in a sack, and they said I have about 2 weeks to live." And Rachel and I were discussing that. He's a mutual friend of ours. And then Ayang Rinpoche looked over at us, I was sitting directly opposite Ayang Rinpoche. He looked over at us and he says, "What are you talking about?" So I told him what we were talking about. Ayang Rinpoche reached into his inner robe and he says, "This is prasad I always carry around with me." Now, prasad is called dutsi in Tibetan. It's herbs rolled into tiny, tiny balls. And those herbs are prayed on by monks and the abbot of monasteries, sometimes for only a day, but sometimes for months. And various rituals are recited over them, mantras and so forth. So they're empowered. One could think of it as the sacrament in Christianity. So Rinpoche pulled out a sack of this and he says, "I've been carrying this for many years. I always collect a little bit from different monasteries of the very auspicious, most auspicious of the dutsis. And I've been, this particular bag of dutsi is all very, very well made, I should say, or well blessed. In other words, there's different kinds of dutsi. There's dutsi that's prayed on for a day or so, or an hour or so, and given out to visitors to the temple. But then there's some that are more auspicious than others when they're prayed over for a long time. And it matters who's praying over them too. You know, sometimes some of the very highest of the masters are praying over them along with the monks. Anyway, so be that as it may, it's pretty unusual for there to be in a batch of dutsi, some from all over and from over extended period of time, but Rinpoche had that. And when he heard what we were saying, he said, he pulled that sack of dutsi out, a small little bag like that. And he says, "I'll give you a little bit of this, and you send it to him. Maybe it will help him." So I received that dutsi, and we spent the rest of the day, finished our picnic and so forth. And then when I got home, I thought of putting it in an envelope and mailing it off. And I had the thought, no, you have to give it to him in person, which means I had to fly to the mainland. I did that. I flew to the mainland with this little bag of dutsi, with a little amount of dutsi that Rinpoche had given me, and decided, rented a car at the airport and found my friend. And I told him what I had just recorded, you know, everything about this dutsi. He was a Buddhist practitioner. He knew what I was talking about. And we went to Lake Shrine, which is Paramahansa Yogananda's ashram, for the day. Before going, we put a little of the dutsi in some water, a quart of water, and I instructed him how to, you know, to just take a little of that water every day until the last days of his, last days on the planet. He took a little right then, and we went to Lake Shrine. His abdomens were in a bag outside of his body. He was very, very thin and weak. We just spent a very lovely afternoon together at Lake Shrine near the ocean in Los Angeles. He met some friends while we were there that came, that by chance he had seen, that had known him for years. and told him of his imminent departure and so forth. And then I returned him to where he was being cared for by a Mexican family. And I left. I got on a plane and flew back to Maui. I didn't know exactly why this, or what would happen with his dutsi. I expected my friend would be blessed by it and that he would be gone in a couple of weeks. But what happened was he went to the hospital after a few days of drinking that spoonful of that dutsi every day, the dutsi that was the water empowered by the dutsi. He started feeling better. He went to the hospital. He was staying only walking distance to the hospital that was treating him. And they examined him and they said, "Your cancer is completely gone." And they had no explanation, but they put his intestines or whatever back in from the bag outside his body that was holding it to inside the body, and told him that he had nothing to worry about anymore, that there's no cancer. This was my friend Sean. He wound up living another 7 or 8 years and passed away under unrelated causes in Mexico. I don't think I had the opportunity to tell Rinpoche that story. I don't remember. I think I waited a couple of days before flying to Los Angeles, and then as time passed, I don't recall telling Rinpoche that. Maybe I did. I don't remember. But it's one of the most remarkable healings, or the most, that I have witnessed. Every evening we went to the teachings on which he gave at the Maui Dharma Center, and those were 2 or 3 hours of teachings and empowerments. When Ayang Rinpoche visited my house, I had many statues in that house of Buddhist images. And I had an incredible 2-foot, amongst other images, a 2-foot or more Vajrakilaya statue. And Rinpoche gazed at all those images, and I said, "You can have any one you want. I'll bring it to Nepal next time I go there. Put it in your monastery." And he didn't say anything for the longest time. And I said, "I can guess which one you want." And I said, "You want the Vajrakilaya." And he said, "You read my mind." That statue wound up in his monastery in Nepal. On the day of its opening, I brought it there. So this great master, he taught throughout his life. Typically, he taught 10-day courses of consciousness transference at the time of death for oneself or for others. These 10-day courses were 10 hours a day. He only charged $10 for each day. it wasn't about the money for Rinpoche, it was about service to the Dharma, serving the Dharma. And that he did throughout his life. One of the signs of a really great teacher, like my own teacher, Master Xuanhua, was that they don't charge for the Dharma. My teacher always would say that, it's a violation of the precepts to sell the Dharma. My teacher taught throughout his life 3 hours a day or more, every evening and often in the afternoon. And there was never a fee charged for any of his teachings. And he was a lineage holder of the Chan sect of Chinese Buddhism. He held that lineage throughout his lifetime, the Weiyang lineage. Similarly, Ayang Rinpoche, he never charged for his teachings. I went to 3 7-day, 10-day courses myself, and in various places. And the energy in the hall when he taught was so pure. And we knew we were receiving teachings from a person who had dedicated his life to doing just that. He traveled very simply. As I mentioned earlier about his bags, one thing I can say about those bags, even though they had all of his very, important ritual objects that were personally very valuable, but also very necessary for his teachings, the whole 30 hours or so that we spent together, touring the Haleakala and eating lunches and breakfasts and stuff, he never once brought up the baggage. Did I get a call about those bags, that luggage? He never asked. When they finally arrived, they arrived. That was that. But I learned from Rinpoche that he never has any more than 2 sets of clothes, one for the wash and one for wearing. He was very much an ascetic person personally. He had no excess. He had nothing fancy. Everything was very simple. And that's the way he lived. And he dedicated his life to the Dharma. And this is so incredibly amazing that in this day and age, in this world that we live in, to see that there are people that are actually teaching the Dharma in a traditional sense. And that was Ayang Rinpoche. He taught from the heart, and he carried the blessings of his teachers to everyone else. So it came from his teachers through him to all. And that's a sign of a very great master. So he passed away December 5th, 2024. He was born in 1942, and he has a monastery in Belkupi in South India, one in Nepal on top of a hill in Bodhanath, and there's other centers I cannot enumerate. So I'm giving this talk, it's finished, and I hope it encourages people to practice the Dharma, maybe even study Phowa for themselves, for helping friends.
Page 549. 过慈悲不舍，爱恋舍受，一切中根不是过生，上好光明越过世间，因我得见其全观音是指，诸菩萨众的世界中，清净庄严，光明妙相根，因我了了得见阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛，南无阿弥陀佛。